Okay, here we go. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Great to see you all. If you're joining us, there's a couple people who are maybe not muted. If you could mute yourselves, that would be fantastic. Welcome to our first CD lecture series of this fall 2021 semester. It's great to see you guys. My name is Brendan Griffiths. I'm faculty here at Parsons, and super excited to introduce our first guest, Keller. Keller is a freelance design director with a background in conversational commerce, banking, and financial services, and also crafting ecosystems for startups. Works across multiple surfaces, iOS, Android, and web, and has led the design of products for tech companies, design agencies, and also startups. Most recently, Ali led 0 to 1 initiatives focused on small and medium-sized businesses at Twitter, and also led a product design team focused on SMS automations, which sounds fascinating. I want to talk more about that. Ali is also an alumna of the Parsons School of Design, our Cornell Tech program, and also the General Assembly program here in New York. So Ali, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, it's my pleasure to turn it over to you. And yeah, super excited to have you here. Thank you again for taking this on. I'll turn it over to you. Awesome. Welcome, Ali.
Awesome. Awesome. It's so good to see some of the old rooms in Parsons. It's been a couple of years. I see someone waving. I'm living for that. I don't know if they're waving at me, but I'm excited. Also, Nico wins for the best dog photo and avatar because I just can't stop staring at that chihuahua. So, hey guys, it's lovely to meet you. Not that long ago, I was actually sitting in many of the rooms that you're in, whether it's the UC, D12. I'm an alumni from the undergrad program focused on design and tech. I built my career primarily in design in the background of UX, product design, building software for people at many companies. It's also inclusive of many of the apps that you have on your phones, like Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. So I have been a part of many social media companies. And I'm super excited to talk to you guys about my career because it's been very traditional in many sense of coming from a design program, but it's been non-traditional for many reasons. One being my background. I am multicultural, I am Black, I am Mexican, I'm also a woman of color based in the US. So this has meant that I've had to forge a really unique path and one that I could sustain because these industries in corporate America are extremely grueling. For those of you that may have already started it, you might be experiencing a little of that in internships, but you also might be fairly new to it and trying to experience what you like, what you don't like. So I will be talking to you guys a bit about all of that stuff. Confirming if somebody could give me a thumbs up that they can see my screen. Awesome. All right, I'm gonna jump in here. So normally when I give these types of presentations, oftentimes they are to other designers. They might be people like at a nonprofit or a startup. So you might see me switch into corporate mode, but I will try to be as honest and real as I can throughout this journey. I like to be really transparent with people, especially about my career in particular and how I've had to redesign it, design it over, walk around it, walk away from some of the biggest things that I've had presented to me so that I could have a sustainable and happy career. So I've titled this final.jpg, a lecture on designing my career. Again, I'm Ali. I'm currently a design lead and director at Forge Design Studios, but I'm also the founder of a really small business called Bone Vintage LA, which I started during the pandemic. So with these things, I always like to introduce myself. On the right, I travel a lot, or I used to pre-pandemic. This is us in Mexico City. Also, I live in Silver Lake, Los Angeles, which is really important to my design practice. After living in New York for about 8 years, working nonstop from pretty much my freshman through senior year, I worked the full time. I was an undergrad, which I know many folks are like, how the hell are you doing that with 16 credits? But luckily you can kind of make things work in internship settings. But also, you know, I like to tell people really honestly that my design practice is really at an intersection of two things. I don't just focus on design in the sense of like graphic design. I also focus on the design of business itself. So that means standing up businesses, whether they're small businesses or also working within humongous ecosystems like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. What's really important to me is to understand how things are operationalized from a sales point all the way to how they're presented through the design of a product. And this is why I say that my career journey has been traditional in some ways, that I have gone to design school, but it's also been non-traditional because I work often with executives and leaders that lead business pillars. I'm not just designing a section of a product, but I'm thinking about the way that design can be impacting an organization. So origin story, a lot of times I see these when I go to design lectures, whether they're like a TED Talk or they are, a 99U conference. There's always kind of an origin story. And I think mine is really rooted, embarrassingly enough, in these two things on the right, Neopets and MySpace. So one of the things I learned at the New School, or a class that I took, focused on sociology, was really focused on the intersection of like humanity and the internet. And I remember the professor giving this lecture specifically saying that the internet was invented for women. And when I heard that, I was like, I don't know, it's kind of an abusive place. I've worked at these companies that build these products. But also it's really true in a sense that a lot of women were provided opportunities for like economic stability through being able to like create. So this has been my form of creation many, many years ago, like tweaking things and understanding how structural elements behind the scenes of a grid could become something more flexible, more customizable. I also really do love early girl culture on the internet, Lisa Frank, sparkly things. This does not actually show up in my design practice, which tends to be more minimal, but it's something that I really care about and making sure that it's cultivated in my sense of being. Also, I like to include in here, I did not think that design for me would show up in owning a small business, but I do own one. I started one in the beginning of the pandemic, just because this was the only thing that was open. And I'll talk a little bit about how I've connected entrepreneurship to my design career and why that's been so, so important in healing for me after coming out of just working for others, why it's so important to have something that is just yours that might not be design at all. So to kick things off before we go into all the places that I've worked at, I like to tell people this really honestly. These are things you should probably know about me as I walk through my journey. So I've broken pretty much every single rule in design. I don't always follow a grid. You'll see things that might be a little bit misaligned. Pixel perfection is something that I can fixate on, but it's not everything to my design practice. Also, like many students in this room that may not admit it, I also complained about school the entire time I was here. It was extremely hard to go to Parsons and to also work, but also just to go to Parsons coming from a background that didn't mean studying design in high school. It was tough. I know some can relate to that, but some are also really passionate about school. I also like to really vocalize within work these days that mental health and wellness at work are growing to be more and more important. These are things that I care about very deeply. You will see entrepreneurship throughout all of my work. I grew up in a home where that was really normal, and this is why design and business go hand in hand for me. So I care very deeply about designers being paid what they are worth and their value, especially when it is people from marginalized backgrounds or people that are not seeing themselves reflected in the design industry. And then I will highlight this a bit, but my career completely shifted my senior year of Parsons when I met someone, and her name is Iobusa Irabor. She has been my mentor for me the last couple of years. And then I made an intentional shift this year from being a design hire within companies to shifting towards entrepreneurship. And what does that look like for me in design? So you guys have probably all seen the creative process. I really do say that this is a lot of my career. I've never fit into a box. I really oftentimes have to flip that box upside down, kind of cut a hole in it, and be like, I kind of like this, but I also kind of hate it. So this is something that has shown up for me quite a bit just throughout my career and trying to identify what is design for me. UX design is not necessarily visual design, but it can influence visual. There's always kind of some method to the madness. And to jump into career. So I've broken this out into just 4 different panels because I've had a really fast trajectory. So in 2015, I was an intern. Today, I'm a director. And that's a pretty rapid trajectory, but it was not without a lot of pain and suffering, a lot of internships, some paid, some unpaid. I think this is probably the part of my journey that I'm most proud of because this is where I think I started. It was my second semester at Parsons as an intern at a brand agency many of you might know by the name of Red Antler. So one of the things that I tell people about this experience is I met one of my closest friends here, but I also like to tell them that I was not necessarily reporting up into like a UX design lead. I was reporting into a strategy lead. And she's actually pretty well known. If you guys have ever read Emily Hayward's book, she is a strategist and like I think the CSO of Red Antler. So she's kind of the genius behind a lot of the brands that influence you in New York that you might see on the subway or the boxes on the side of the road. A lot of those ideas actually originate from her. This was my first experience working in an agency setting. This was my first corporate experience at all. It was like a pretty small company, roughly like 50 to 70 people back when I worked with them in 2015 as like an intern into a freelancer. But for those of you that don't know what it is that Red Antler does, so these are some of the brands that they have worked to found, but most recognizable would likely be brands like Casper, the box itself, Allbirds, pre-IPO. I included this picture of the ice cream because this is one of the last companies I worked with, and this is my hand. The photographer that I want to highlight here would be Suzanne Seraph, who many of you might have on your Pinterest. She's a really good friend. We met each other in the back room of Red Antler, and our careers have both taken kind of interesting paths. So Suzanne works with companies like Prada. You might see her work actually popping up in ads for like Smirnoff. She's a very recognizable artist, and we both cross paths. We actually know similar people from, I think, childhood. I just have to have a shameless plug for her because I adore her and love her. And if you're not following her, you should be, because she will bring so much inspiration to your work, and especially around color theory and just explorations around abstract shape. So to get into the work, this on the right is actually a project I worked on doing all the UX. I've read at Antler, my focus was specifically on like building foundational UX into my design process, but specifically understanding how to translate like a user's needs or how to translate research about a client or how they were different and turn that into something that could be sold. This has become a really big theme in my career as I tend to work for companies that ultimately are helping either a client to sell something, helping a user to achieve something, or a company looking to make profit. Ultimately, most companies have a way that they are producing revenue, whether we realize it or not. We're either buying that service. If it's social, they're selling you advertising. This was where I built a foundation in understanding how does design work as a part of that sales engine and that tool. So something that turns out like this is a piece of design, or at least it was for me in my process pretty early on. Whether you're defining a persona to interview or writing a research script, I read at Antler, I learned how to turn this into something like this, which lends itself to something like this, which is able to be sold on something like this. And those are parts of design that really early in my career, I did not understand how they were all intertwined. But the more and more that I've gone through leading teams or building product at great companies, the more I've realized that this is just as important as this, if not more important. It's your foundation that you build from. So Red Antler is where I kind of built that discovery tool and that kind of toolkit to power through the next role. So this is where I tell people things kind of begin to converge. I interned at many of the companies you'll see, but in this role specifically, it was going from UX design and really lending itself to product design. In UX design, oftentimes you'll see that it can be something that is grayscale, it's wireframes. You might hear roles throughout, your career journeys of UX design, visual design, UI engineer. UX design is, oh, you'll hear the dogs barking like crazy. Okay. In UX design specifically, it's about understanding how to translate user behavior into something more tangible. But in product design, you're switching from being a specialist that might focus on one thing into something that's more of a generalist. So what does that look like? Working at Code and Theory, I'd like to tell people, one, incredible things can happen when you work on a diverse team with friends that you'll have for a lifetime. Some of you might be working at agencies or debating between like an agency, a startup, big tech, like a series A, B, C, D, like what do all these things mean? Code and Theory was a pretty sizable agency pre-acquisition. So I worked with them when they were still in the Warhol building right off Prince and Broadway on the second and third floor, and specifically worked with them on a financial tech incubator. So really great body of work from this time here. On the right-hand side, you kind of see concepts that we were thinking about and testing. So this part of my career was really focused on, like I said, shifting from being that specialist that was at Red Antler, focused on like UX strategy, research, wireframing, to blending that in with art direction, visual design, design components, and a design system. And I think, 2016 was around the time when Facebook was really coming out with this language around like product designer and what does this mean? And here's these prestigious companies that are Google and Facebook and Instagram hiring product designers. This was pre-internship at Facebook. So this was my opportunity to really understand what is product design, because I'm hearing these words and I don't understand what it all means. So designing financial literacy was really the focus of the products that I worked on, specifically with Code and Theory. So the client, you'll see kind of a blend between Code and Theory and City Ventures. City Ventures was a client of Code and Theory. And I was really focused at the time on looking into this idea of financial literacy, me being a part of a team of about 6 other women and a producer. We worked in small pods. We really had to assess really rapidly, how does design thinking become a part of a business? How do you create an incubator? What does an incubator mean? To just rapidly test and iterate and come up with ideas that could be tested and vetted and produce revenue for a company as big as Citibank. So this idea of MVPs, feature value matrices, this idea that design becomes a tool to really understand how to design like fulfillment into a business, or how to scope a new market, or all this like fancy language of how can you use design thinking and tooling to help business leaders understand how they can create business models from, just a series of exercises, whether it's crazy eights, or getting at the time it was sketch, or sketching on a piece of pencil and paper. How do you design for that? So this was a period of time where I was introduced to the idea of design research and also product research. So conducting lab research with testing participations and iterating off the design based on what you hear. How do people navigate through the flow you've created? And I like to highlight it like this, because this will become something that for those of you that do go the tech route, you'll become very familiar with the idea of testing and segmenting testing studies to understand as you're design solving problems. So this is a deliverable. I'll take you guys through some of the deliverables you might see. If you work at different companies, these are the deliverables that I had. Over time, you'll watch the language of my portfolio likely change a bit because of the different titles I held. But what I want to emphasize here is that for me in design, research has become a huge foundation. In addition to that strategy portion that I got from Red Antler, research became the most influential part of my design process from Code and Theory. So crafting a research script, some of you might have classes where you're like, why am I writing a research script? Why am I doing this ethnographic research? It ends up adding a foundation to the way that you pitch your work. And it ends up being kind of a soul to the design, so that you're not just designing for yourself, but instead you're designing for a potential person or a user or a need. Whether that's graphic design or product design or UX design, these will become fundamental tools that are part of your toolkit, or at least they were for me. I wanted to highlight different deliverables that I had. So throughout this time of my career, I was still working within those grayscale design systems, still kind of iterating, learning a bit more about how typeface kind of works together, working with the creative director and art director who was kind of guiding me through how you could make something in grayscale still beautiful and still making sure it communicates the right deliverables, and then escalating that up into something that is actually like color, design, iconography. So Trista, I'll have to get her last name so that you guys can look her up. She's an incredible art director. She's also a freelance designer. She created this design system, and it was actually in it that I was able to iterate on. So I take no credit for all of this, but I was on a team of women that were really thinking through how all of these pieces kind of fit together. And those wireframes provided life for something like this to come into. So all of these typography patterns What I like to tell people is that when you're in an agency, when you're in an agency, you might not be working within something called a design system, but you will be doing that if you work with a company that has like a sizable design team and you're all working on a product that needs to be cohesive. So this is some of the deliverables that were kind of designed through my time at Code and Theory as an intern. But really what I like to tell people is the meat of it came from this idea of UX research and understanding what it meant to work in a lab and using language like empathy-driven conversations or takeaways or insights to inform my design process. Those became the biggest tools that I needed to carry with me through companies like Facebook, and then especially companies like Instagram, which craft and excellence is built into the product's DNA. So skipping over this, there will be a little bit. There'll be a motorcycle in the background, which is my neighbor. There'll be a little bit of insights that pop up throughout my portfolio or just my body of work, because I found that to be some of the most impactful and meaningful work. It's kind of the thing that lives on, whether your product ships or not. That's a piece of language that I found to become more and more familiar. The idea of shipping is that your product is live in the world somewhere, but with tech companies, you don't always ship due to business needs. But you do as a designer get to take away insights, takeaways, the way that you worked with people, the way that you bridged gaps. Those became the things that I built my portfolio and my sense of understanding within design on. So MVP documentation, all that good stuff. Essentially, all of this work that I did at Code and Theory was in an incubator style. So it's a pretty small team. You know, you work with a client or you work with a production team to hand off a file. When you're an agency working with a company or tech company, you don't really see that product through all the time. Sometimes you're an implementation partner, which means that you're embedded to actually build it out. But in this case, you know, we handed things off in decks. And it's kind of hard to say goodbye. And Facebook was quite the opposite of this, because I was watching something all the way through its life cycle. So to go into that, to really be from a UX designer on an agency side into a product designer at a tech company, I'm going to walk you guys through some of the work at Facebook. So what I tell people is that this was around the time Facebook was about 600 people or 600 designers when I worked there. I'm sure now it's probably 3 times that size. The company doubled between the time that I worked there in 2017 and 2018. Who knows how big that design team is now, but I worked on a team called Facebook Pages, which at the time was like a legacy product. We pretty much all of us, I'm sure, have engaged with a Facebook page at some point over the last 10 to 15 years. But I tell people that working at Facebook was probably the most informational time of my design career, because I was shifting from an agency model, which means that, you know, you are paid as a company or like a contractor externally, to being embedded in a team. And Facebook does have some of the most famous designers that I've ever worked alongside, but also more importantly, they have one of the most interesting things I've ever experienced, which is the idea of a tech campus. It's probably the coolest place the coolest office I've ever visited. I used to call them free Ubers, would drive you around. Like, all of the TikToks that you guys may be seeing online of like, what is it like to work at a company like Facebook? Those are all very real. It's actually better than that because everything is free. So it was just a really impressionable time, I think, for me in my career, but also really grueling and hard. And I say that because I had to make a huge shift. This idea of the big blue, Facebook is one. Facebook Inc. incorporates Instagram, it incorporates WhatsApp, it incorporates Oculus, it incorporates Messenger. And all of these products, I feel like I'm missing one. No, that's all 5 of them. All of these products have unique nuances in the people that use them. But this was a time, I think, in my career where I was only used to designing for hypothetical situations based off of user needs. Like, I would research, you know, do secondary research or go online and Google like who uses this type of product. But Facebook, you're looking at a use case of 2 billion people, and that is a lot of people, and a lot of data goes into like doing analysis on that type of like group of people, and a design can influence behavior quite dramatically when you're working with that type of data set versus when you're designing not necessarily for people, but kind of for a business. So Facebook Pages, in my case studies online, I'm gonna put some things up on the screen, but I'm actually just going to talk to you about like this experience. So Facebook pages, while it is based in the US, there's a huge group of people outside of this country that use Facebook. In fact, more people outside of the country use Facebook than in it occasionally. It depends on the product surface. Don't quote me on that, but it's really important to think about inclusivity and how inclusivity lends itself to access. So, you know, how we might experience 5G in some big cities, that's not the case for folks that might be international. And thinking about how a design can render on a device locally versus internationally, or what local means to us in the US versus what local might mean in a different country, a different city, a different kind of bandwidth. Facebook was one of those opportunities where I could kind of learn what that feels like. So this is my introduction to dog fooding, which is kind of a really disgusting name or way to say using your device or using your product or what you design in the context of how someone might experience that. So I use, you know, an iOS device. I spent a lot of time dog fooding on Android. I also began to build a domain expertise here, or this is how, you know, I have to market it to executives. I began to build an understanding of what a small business is and what does that look like when you're using a device to tell a story. Facebook was foundational for me, I would say, before going to Instagram, and those two powerhouses of Facebook and Instagram were instrumental in me co-founding a team at Twitter. So I like to tell people, or this is how I used to hear it, is that Pages is a historic design surface, which means that there's a way that things have to look. It's, you know, not always going to be the most beautiful surface, but it doesn't necessarily have to be when hundreds of millions of people are using it. It needs to be logical. It needs to make sense. And that's a big reason why, you know, you see things on like huge tech companies like Instagram. You guys might all be experiencing a different version of the app, but that's really intentional because there are things that if you are to move something locally to us, it might make sense, but you know, if you're abroad, perhaps it doesn't make sense, or perhaps it doesn't render the same in another language. Everything in Facebook taught me to be very intentional and very thoughtful about my design process. And I worked on persona development, or just understanding, you know, coming from a UX background into a product design background. The biggest shift that I have to say I had to make was just understanding, you know, what does it look like to design one thing for two different use cases? And use cases being, you know, Facebook Pages is almost like a two-sided marketplace, or as a consumer, you and I might log in and look at Glossier's page and be like, oh, this looks, you know, totally like, you know, I can message them, I can find their location in the real world, but what about the admin that runs that page? Their experience, FedEx truck, their experience might be a little bit different. So thinking about all of those things and how do you design for that became a huge part of my process. And with design in general, this is like pre-prototyping it with users. What became a foundational portion of my design process at Facebook was learning how to prototype. It's something that has changed a bit with the introduction of Figma. At the time, you know, we were working within Sketch and accompanying like a framer or an origami, but the idea of product design at Facebook really is about making sure you can prototype, making sure you can understand how is this going to look in a device frame. We were rendering in Samsung because a majority of users use this type of device, but interaction design and how does it feel? How does, like, is it feel wonky? Does it feel like things are unhooked? Or like, does this make sense when you experience it with design patterns in motion? Motion introduces a huge and new varying way to work as a product designer, and specifically at tech companies. It's now just a standard practice. In Figma, it's changed a bit because Figma changes completely how we work. You can actually prototype live in Figma, which is fantastic, but there are designers who I've worked with, and I myself at times will specialize in specific interaction design, emotion design, because you want something to feel beautiful when it's rendered, whether that's on a mobile device or on a desktop screen. And I wanted to highlight a couple of things here. So from my time Citibank to here, the beginning, I think I should paint this more through design systems. So when I was at Citibank, we had a lot more flexibility with the art direction of creating a design system that maybe felt more beautiful at times, but in design systems at a company that's being leveraged by hundreds of millions of people and also billions. At the time in 2017, we hit about 2 billion. There's definitely a pattern within design or design of an app this big that has to feel consistent. So every single component that you see here, each of these are design components within a library that's defined by design systems designers. So that's a team of probably over 25 people just working to make designers who design products' lives easier. So a design systems designer's specialty is quite different from a product designer's specialty. The two go hand in hand, but every single thing that you see here is a component within a library defined specifically for Facebook. And they have a library that's massive. If you can imagine, how does language fit into it? How does a language that, reads left to right differentiate from a language that reads right to left? These are all the components that can be leveraged in both of those use cases. There's an infinite number of use cases around accessibility, but we all know what it's like when a device breaks in a language or just doesn't load or render properly, or you can see alignment being off. A design systems team builds components to make things really accessible no matter what the circumstances, whether it's 2G or 5G, or whether you're on Wi-Fi at a coffee shop with low bandwidth or not, or using cellular data. All of these components are thought of really intentionally and designed to be stress tested in those environments. So going through flows, these are things that were done while I was at Facebook. Often presented this to a crit full of designers, which was really often intimidating as an intern. The Pages team at the time, I think, was like 22 to 27 people that were like, from L6, which would be a senior designer, all the way up to principal level designers, getting feedback and putting this work in front of, for the first time ever for me, a huge design team that was shipping work all the time. So I'm gonna skip through this really quick. So again, kind of talking about that two-sided marketplace, some of you in your projects will begin to think about, what does it look like if you're visiting versus creating? This is something that I think a lot more about as a design leader, I guess now within a Forge, but thinking about how things might look and feel between two different experiences. Those were really, really, really challenging concepts for me making a switch from UX into product design, and often led to tears and stress and frustration. But I say those things knowing that many of you will go through these internships or these experiences, or are designing products today, or will found your own companies, thinking about several different scenarios in which somebody might experience your product. So this is the big daddy, I like to say, because it's a product that many of us cannot live without, whether we would like to or not. It was definitely the product where I learned the most about craft and just design, and how design can be built into a culture in a company. So Instagram is oftentimes the little sister within Facebook. The campus is significantly smaller. I worked at the time, 2018, summer of 2018. I worked at the time where the Instagram shopping team was getting a huge investment. It was like a pretty small team when I was there, believe it or not. And I was working there during the time where they were thinking about, what was the next evolution of IG shopping. So when business and design kind of intersect, it's really interesting to be on those teams. They become flashier teams. This was a really small team. I worked there when Ian Spalter was the head of design, which was really incredible. I worked under two directors, or I guess heads of design, that were Black or people of color. And that was definitely instrumental in the way that I saw leadership and who I wanted to aspire to become in the tech industry or as a designer. So very chic, very cool, very New York. That's how I describe Instagram. I worked in the Frank Gehry building off Astor Place. Their office is just incredible, and on the top floor over there. But working at Instagram I had just come out of working where I met Julia, actually. I just come out of spending a year at Parsons and at Cornell Tech. And I don't think I would have landed on my feet as well at Instagram if I had not had that experience, because as a designer, one of the most challenging things that I think I experienced pre-Instagram was learning how to speak about my work, learning how to speak in front of an audience of people, learning how to communicate my ideas or my values, or what was it in design that I cared the most about in my work. Speaking, there was often a time, I think I like to tell people, from the time from Red Antler until the beginning of Facebook, I could barely introduce myself to a room of people. It was so hard for me to speak about my design. I was so designs. I was so nervous. I would often like shake under the table. But by the time I got to Cornell Tech, they were putting us in so many situations where we had to pitch and sell. By the time I got to Instagram, I was a lot more prepared to speak in front of a room of people who were probably infinitely more intelligent than I was, might have a background in ML, might be, 10 years my senior. I was becoming a lot more used to becoming uncomfortable. And that is like the biggest piece of advice that I can give people, is that Instagram was a time period where I stopped being so nervous of being wrong or right, and got a lot more comfortable being like, I have no idea. I need to find that out through data or market, or just asking questions, or getting to know people, or understanding that like my domain expertise might be, in understanding people and value, and translating that from a sketch to a design, and using a design system to tell that story, to more being like, I have no idea what I'm solving. I'm totally freaked out, and I need to figure this out in 12 weeks, or I'm not going to get a return offer. All of those things, all of those stresses are very real for me. So small businesses and social sales funnels, and like, why does that even matter when you're a designer? So a small business, I like to tell people, pre-COVID, I think more like Fortune 100 and 500 companies were having a moment. But if you've been in New York long enough, you may have noticed the rise of the direct-to-consumer brand, and how oftentimes startups is just a fancy word for smaller, medium-sized businesses. I was lucky enough to be one of the first designers to look at what that kind of experience was like for Instagram shopping and small businesses. So NDAs, many of you might be experiencing that after your summer internships, or if you've had them already. We can't get into the details of what I created, but I'll talk to you a little bit around what I learned. I had an opportunity to lead research studies, which meant recruiting people, understanding what their business needs were. I talked to one small business at the time. I talked to another one that, was a substantially larger business, and put designs in front of them in a device and asked them to tell me what they thought about my work. And, that's extremely hard to do. Oftentimes, I recommend that you have a research partner that can facilitate a study for you of your design, so that you don't ultimately drive a participant down bias. Open-ended questions and the way that you structure a study is as important as the design that you put in front of them. I'll talk a little bit about that from my time at Twitter. But this is something I kind of put up. It looks different than this. I pulled this from an old deck, but these are screenshots of when I worked at Instagram, some of the surfaces that I was learning to design with or around, and what it meant to design like a testing, a flow. Would look a lot like me building an animated prototype and walking people through screens that include components like this. For some of you, this is the evolution of Instagram shopping. It's come quite a long ways. Instagram ads as well has come quite a long ways. It's really impressive to see what they've done with the product, and how subconscious their influence is on all of us. So impact and design and research, again, NDAs make it really tough. But this is something that, for those of you that do go on to work at tech companies, the most valuable thing I learned from Instagram was working with data science. This is a pattern, or like, this is a role that you hear less about. You do always hear about product managers or product owners or engineering, front end, back end, design engineering. But one of the most valuable things I could probably leave you with is get to know your data science partners, because those are the people that are studying the way that we all engage with the world, or engage with models that are embedded into the products that we use. And learning how to work with data, or what data means and how it will influence your design, could be like just instrumental to the way that you create. So working with the data science, for me, I worked with her name was Ida. She was so fantastic, like just fantastic. I also have to say that I was very lucky to work with a lot of people of color and women of color on this team. Both of my engineering teams as well, from the time that I worked at Facebook and Instagram, were also 50-50 women, which is really rare. And in product, and I like to tell people in product, whether that's a tech company or a startup, you see a difference in the way that you're able to flow through your work process when you work on diverse and inclusive teams. It takes a while to begin to differentiate your experience through design, or how quick people are to receive an idea, but it is really invaluable to work on teams that have different opinions, different abilities, disabilities, different lived experiences influence the way that we design, engineer, and build product at scale. So I also like to leave people with the fact that shopping on different surfaces, there's feed, there's stories, there's checkout that you guys may have experienced, there's also ads. This was my first experience, I would say, designing a product or designing on a product that had different experiences within the same app. It wasn't just a page, it was an ecosystem. Prototyping end to end too, that was really tough because it no longer was just, translating designs into components that are static, but the movement of motion within design work and specifically within product design and systems thinking was extremely challenging to account for when you're moving at such a fast pace. So if Facebook and Instagram move at like a very high velocity, what that essentially means is these are engineering driven and founded companies. When you have a founder, like a CEO that was an engineer, there's a heavy investment in the way that a system is built and architected. Engineering speed often is a little bit different than design speed. Designers are designing when you're in meetings, you're designing when you're thinking, you're designing when you're taking a walk, whereas engineering might be really focused on execution and how many lines of codes that they are delivering. Companies like Facebook and Instagram, you're moving very fast. Also, again, bringing it, full circle, working on scripts, sourcing the companies that I spoke to, leading those research sessions without a researcher, that's really tough stuff, especially at a company that is really big. These were huge takeaways that I was able to guide into Twitter and also in building partnership and friendship with researchers that I worked with in the future companies that I'll show you. Also, as a designer, many of you today might be learning about design practice and typography and color palette and theory and how consciously all these things flow up into a larger understanding of like an average person in design. And, when they look at a stop sign, how are they actually able to interpret like red means stop, or at least in the context of the US. Synthesizing, distilling, and handing off insights, the faster you can do this within your design process and the more you learn how to integrate your design practice into these big fancy words, the faster you will be able to drive consensus. And a big portion of my design process or learning about design at these tech companies has been driving consensus. How can you be inclusive of somebody's opinion in your design process when you disagree? How can you be inclusive when you don't know? All of those things kind of came together and laddered up into my understanding of design for a company. So I realize I'm at the 15-minute mark. I'm going to speed through a couple of things. I'm almost done because your questions are going to be most valuable. So why do you see this big thing called Insightfully? So Io is my mentor. She also is probably the architect from Instagram all the way moving into now of my career. So a majority of my career, I spent it freelancing, I spent it interning, I was going to school, whether it was 7 to 9 p.m. at night. I know many of you have taken those night classes for those of you who have attended school in person. Whether you're a freshman, sophomore, you'll get used to the 7 to 9s, and I was working all day. And Io is somebody that I met at the building by Union Square. I met her online in a Women in Product Facebook group, and she completely transformed the way that I do my work and the way that I valued myself and the way that I was architecting my career. So it's really rare when you meet somebody who is a mentor, but also somebody who is a coach that helps you re-understand what it means to be someone who is at work. And I say at work being like, at work might be freelancing, at work might be your side projects, at work might be the internships that transform from a 1099 into a W-2. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Some of you are like, what the hell? Like, I don't do taxes, I don't care. But some of these things for me, I had been an entrepreneur up until the point where I received a full-time offer at Instagram. And I was really considering, okay, I'll just, it's a great salary, it's 6 figures, it's got a sign-on bonus and equity package, and like, I've never seen this much money in front of me, and I'm a designer, and like designers don't normally, pull in these types of figures. And it wasn't until that I met Io that I was able to do the work to understand, well, if I take a full-time offer and I have this other offer, that means that I can freelance and continue understanding what design is. I might be doing myself a disservice. So I highlight Io as probably the most instrumental portion of my pivot from being a full-time employee into being an entrepreneur. But she was also I guess, not even a designer, because she really is a career strategist. She was the person that helped me understand how all of those slides that you saw before meant that I wasn't just an entry level designer. It actually equated to being able to lead product design teams and be able to lead design thinking at companies. So this was a big shift for me because, when you have titles that say intern or freelancer or, junior designer or associate designer, it can be really hard to not align your value as a designer to that. When you might have 5 years of experience as an intern through Parsons, you should not be accepting an offer at an L3 level or junior level. There's this idea around titles in design. It can be super frustrating and confusing. There's a million titles out there, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what it meant for me to step outside of being an entry-level title designer into a senior designer or a lead product designer leading several initiatives. So I was brought onto Twitter. I spent about 9 months after I graduated at Parsons in 2019, building a commerce product for a stealth startup between the US and China. And that looked like me working with executive teams with titles like CEO, COO, directors of data to build out about 80 flows for a product that was consumer facing. So when I joined Twitter, I was coming off working directly with executive leadership, having just graduated in 2019, which was pretty unheard of, I think, for a lot of people. But that was really, really challenging for me to go from an entrepreneurship setting where I was freelancing to going back to a W-2 where I was full-time. But what I'd like to tell people about Twitter is that this is where I met some of my closest friends in tech. I met Sunny Wong, who was my researcher and counterpart, and one of the closest friends I have. I also worked with great product leaders that helped me to, I think, mature in a way and provide closure in a way that I was ready after I left Twitter to step back into entrepreneurship. So Twitter for Business, I was the founding designer on this team. I tell people designing a roadmap, because designing a roadmap means that you are designing not just for the components on the screen, but designing a new market, opening up a new market. And I worked with a VP of product, or essentially a senior director of product, to think about a vision for small and medium-sized businesses on Twitter. And that's not just one thing. There were several surfaces that I worked across. I worked on the team when I think it was 120 designers. I was in the New York office in Chelsea, right by the old Barney's. But I co-founded the team. I was the first designer on emerging businesses. And that is not an easy weight to carry when you're kind of one-on-one. I had to learn how to navigate a corporate environment, coming from an environment where you're fully trusted as an entrepreneur or a vendor. Being embedded, this was my first time really standing something up within a corporate environment as a full-time employee. And again, I was coming from a year of social selling between 2 different continents and understanding what it meant to stand up a product 0 to 1. So I like to tell people, Twitter was extremely influential for the way that I learned how to step into being a leader of teams and not just a designer, because my team was extremely tight knit. We were a very special team that was extremely close, but we also grew from being just 2 people to an international team. I worked with people across every time zone from PST all the way to GMT. So I worked with a team that was embedded in London on ad tech, re-envisioning products. I worked with people in Texas. I worked with people in New York. I worked with people in LA. I worked across every time zone. And then a little bit of this isn't the final product. If you guys would like to see what I designed, you can see some of the announcements from the Twitter handle for business. So I designed business profiles across a breadth of different products. This is how we started, but how we ended is newly shipped and should be coming out pretty soon. And just to shift this over before we get to Q&A in the last couple of slides, this I'd say was probably one of the hardest roles for me to walk away from and to stop working on. I got extremely sick with COVID in December. It took about 3 months to recover from being that ill. But I tell people that by the time I left Twitter in December, this was a really, really strong foundation for me to jump into something that was much more familiar for me, which was stepping into a role that was leadership, managing teams, building people's careers, and not just focusing on design for being design. about 3 years out of where you guys are at in undergrad, but I became a manager pretty quickly because it felt really normal for me to manage and to be comfortable with ambiguity and to be comfortable like carving out a path for myself when I never saw myself represented, or I saw myself represented twice, but at the highest level, not necessarily as a design peer. So from lead designer to director, which is a fancy title, but sometimes the one I feel the most disconnected from. I work at Forge. I think I got told by my boss, they're like, this is a fancy Google font logo, don't mess it up. So I can see it's not rendering properly. But today my job looks so different than being, at a big fancy company. I work for designers who are pretty legendary in the industry. Scott and Becky have changed dramatically the way that I work. But honestly, we're a small team of like about 5 people, and it's totally different being a designer in that environment. It's totally different hiring people. It's totally different jumping in a design box when sometimes I'm rusty because I've been managing people's career letters. Life for me looks much different and has throughout all of 2021. And just to bring it full circle, like I'm probably somewhere in the middle of the chaos and like making sure that my severe anxiety or depression doesn't bubble up all the time and influence the way that I'm working. But like this is really like my career journey. It's not a linear line. It has never been, because I've been always more aggressive of wanting the bigger title or the better pay, or figuring out how to hack my career and take on multiple projects at once. Ultimately, I am an entrepreneur. So no more slides after this portion. I'm not designing as much. I'm just hiring people now. So I put my email up here. If you guys need jobs, if you want internships, if you want to talk, I am available to you as a resource. I'm very transparent, and I try to say normal as best as possible, because ultimately I did live in New York for almost a decade, so I'm a little crazy too. But I do want to open this up for you guys. Thank you so much for having me. I would love to answer any questions that you might have. So I'll stop sharing.
Ali, thank you so much. Wow, it's incredible to see that journey and that trajectory. Yeah, understanding that you're only 3 years so out of this place. Yeah, that's pretty incredible. So thank you so much for sharing all of that work and your insights. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much more time, so I'll just open the floor for anyone who has questions. Please feel free to just unmute yourselves and speak up. But Ali, thank you again. You can also use the chat if you prefer, and I will read them.
Maybe I can warm us up with a question, Ali. So we've already started talking a lot about like language and like the language of design and the language of specific, sub-disciplines. And obviously like you are so well practiced in the language of design for tech, at this point in a very short period of time. Do you have any tips for like how, because obviously you did not know any of this stuff like 5 years ago, right? None of these terms. Do you have any advice for somebody who wants to learn that language quickly?
Yes.
Like, what do you do? How do you do that?
Okay, so this was the hack that I realized a couple years ago when I was at my like most frustrating points of design, or when I was blocked or didn't know. I would put on a podcast in the background while I would design. The first one would be like NPR How I Built This, because there was people from software companies, direct to consumer companies, every different vacuums. They would talk about their journey, and I was learning and picking up really quickly what it was that they were saying. They would say like deliverable, or to launch, or MVP, and they would define this language and then explain what it meant in context of their products. So NPR How I Built This, I would listen to in the background of my design while I would sketch. Also a lot of TED Talks. And I also attended a lot of lectures, a lot of podcasts, a lot of seminars. I was just like in my beginning stages of like, especially freshman and sophomore year, I was just maxing out all my time just learning. Like if I didn't know something, I would sign up for a class. If I was curious about something, I'd sign up for like a writing workshop. Whether it was Parsons or another design institution, I was just attending lectures at least once a week so that I could become more comfortable with things that I just like did not understand at all.
A couple of questions in the chat. Bridget is asking if you found it difficult to work with companies' strict characters and personalities, sort of brand personalities, to clarify, when creating visual design.
Yes, And that used to enrage me. It used to make me really angry, if I can be honest, because it felt like I had to color within their box or their confines or the design systems. And then it would come out for me in really passive aggressive ways. Like, which would be like going to design crit and a designer that was more senior than me being like, why did you make this decision that you made? And I was like, well, I had to make it this way because this is all I've got. So that is why I strongly encourage to not be passive aggressive and to instead take on projects kind of outside of those disciplines to have creative fulfillment. There are ways to get creative within strict like brand guidelines and like brand personalities. You know, you kind of have to work with what you've got to tell the story that you need to tell. But absolutely was challenging and really frustrating, especially when I didn't know how to work with what I had. I wanted to, in the beginning, I used to get feedback a lot that like I needed to work within, you know, the lines, or I needed to work within what existed. I still get that feedback today sometimes, but I don't like it, so I tend to break it. That being said, there's times to break it, there's times when you don't, but it's always been a challenge for me.
Thank you. Nietzsche asks, she's wondering what the application process is like for applying into tech companies, and yeah, just if you have sort of recommendations there. You know, obviously you have quite a bit of experience in that kind of arena.
Yeah, you know what? Admittedly, sometimes people get discouraged when I say this, but I've almost never applied for a job. I've been recruited for almost every company I've worked at or applied through by some grace of God or the universe. That being said, I know every hack into getting to a tech company. So a couple years ago when I was at Parsons, Facebook used to make pit stops. Google would make pit stops during the career fairs, but it would be impossibly long. To get into those lines because they were reviewing resumes so rapidly. So the best way to do this is one, apply online. Two, LinkedIn is now your friend. LinkedIn keyword search is now your best friend because many people at these huge tech companies actually have a preference for designers that are at Parsons or they actually really would love to recruit design students, but it can be hard to find people that are specifically interested in tech and not just brand. So I would say there's programs targeted at university students. If you Google Facebook University or Facebook internships, Amazon University or internships, Twitter and LinkedIn are now your best friend, and you need to go through recruiters and reach out to them directly with cold emails and build your portfolios. That's probably the best thing that you can do to get in front of those people and be substantial or different. Also, interning through the semester is always the most impressive thing to them.
Fantastic. I'll maybe read one more, and then if someone wants to also answer from the audience. But what was one class that you found most helpful during your time at Parsons? Did you take electives that sort of guided you in choosing your career?
So I came to Parsons after I did a semester, I did 2 semesters at UNLV, hated it, took a year off school. I modeled in New York very briefly during Fashion Week of 2012, hated that. Went to FIT for a semester, really sucked at business and was better at design, took a course at GA, and then by the time I landed, all those years later, by the time I landed at GA or General Assembly, I knew that I wanted to go to Parsons. I knew what I wanted my career to be, and I knew that I wanted to make at least $80,000 a year, which was the median salary at that time around 2014. Now it's about 120 out of school for L3 at tech companies. But I knew what I wanted to do by the time I came to Parsons. So I'll be very honest there. That being said, I ended up coloring way too much in my comfort zone around, taking electives that I thought would support me. The best class I took was Our Lives on the Internet, which is through Lang. It's an elective that I think you guys have the option to take, I think, junior year. And it's a sociology class about the way that, ML and like origins on the internet lend itself to like the sociology study of humans. After I took that class, I knew I didn't want to work at Facebook anymore. I think I had realized what Facebook was doing, how bias and like facial recognition technology played a role in the criminalization of Black and brown people. So there's a lot there that was really informative, and it was the class that I remembered the most. So sociology classes are the ones that I probably would recommend.
That actually maybe leads into the next question that's in the chat, which is, how would you describe the interplay or relationship that you had with the ethics of UX practice, and does that influence your work, then or now?
It does now, but it didn't in the beginning. Because in the beginning, I was an absolute machine that was looking to like maximize like how much profit I could generate. And like some people will cringe hearing that. But I grew up in a house that like tell people of hustlers, my mom's in private practice. I had only known how to build a business. My dad's an entrepreneur, my aunt's an entrepreneur, my mentors were entrepreneurs. And like I only knew what it meant to be like a machine. As I began to become more comfortable in my UX practice and wasn't just taking gigs because I was like, I gotta pay my rent in Brooklyn. Ethics became a huge portion of the way that I work because I began to see how the things I was making were impacting people's lives. And when you're doing that at scale for millions of people, you begin, I think, as a designer over the years to want to put more good into the world. Some people don't care. Some people are like, nah, I work for the company has to be, accountable ethically. But I think as a person, in the last 2 to 3 years as I think through the Trump era is when I began to be like, oh no, like I need to be really thoughtful because everything I put into the world can change somebody's life. It can change the way that people engage with the internet. It can change the life of somebody. So ethics became a really important part for me to at least be mindful of speaking to my design practice. Money is still important. We have to pay the bills. We all like nice things and beautiful things, but ethics and knowing that you have to be accountable at the end of the day have become a big part of my practice in the last, I would say, 2 years, not 3, but 2 years.
There's one more. We're kind of at time. There's one more question in the chat I can relay to you, and then we can open the floor. I know some folks have to go, but I'll just put this out there, which is, and I think this is a really great one, actually. This comes up, folks I speak to all the time. How did you translate designing in a classroom context, right, in a school setting? Designing for projects, homework exercises, right, things that are often kind of theoretical, to working in corporate settings, which, I mean, as you mentioned, are, really results driven, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you know what? I think I'm most grateful for Parsons because I had to learn how to create outside of just one medium. I had come from a background of photography. I had to learn Figma and Sketch and all that on my own. But Parsons really taught me how to get in front of people through crit. I think crit was the most invaluable thing for me to bring into corporate because it meant that I had to stop being scared of being wrong. It meant that I had to get comfortable with getting pushed back on. It meant that I had to get comfortable with presenting things that weren't always like complete or were half-baked. And I think the most invaluable thing for me, just like personally, was actually being in the laser cutting lab because I was learning how to work with my hands. So in the corporate America, you kind of tend to lend yourself towards a specific portion of design, whether it's like your title's like brand designer or UX designer. Maybe you're only working in that medium. What the classroom gave me was the ability to be experimental without shame, the ability to be experimental without judgment or having to tie it to a business goal. Like creating to create is extremely hard. But when you get into corporate America, you're no longer doing that. So the 4 years that I had just to make things for me or just to learn tools became the most invaluable things when I was learning how to solve business problems. I still rely on a lot of the skills that I learned at Parsons around getting comfortable with ambiguity. I would not be as comfortable as I am if I did not go to art school. I also wouldn't be as comfortable with sketching or with, picking up different mediums and trying things. That's something that I developed a nuance and like comfortability around in art school and labs and research labs on our campuses, trying things I didn't understand, breaking things, taking things apart, especially with like the DT program in particular. That's really common. But I just got comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's something art school will give you if you let it, but you have to allow it to do that.
That's a great answer. Thank you. We have maybe time for one more question if anyone wants to ask one.
I will put my email in the chat.
Can I?
Oh, go ahead, Zachary.
Okay, yeah. How do you balance, because obviously like you're quite young for kind of like the roles that you've assumed. How do you balance like just kind of like growing in life and also just your workload as well?
Yeah, so full transparency, I'm 27. A lot of my work and life, I did not have one. I was like I said, I was a machine. And that meant that like I worked 7 days a week. I'm also balanced by a partner who also works this much, who's also an entrepreneur. There were so many heartbreaking moments where he was able to go out on the weekends and I was at the school and the lab and the UC studying a lot of my life and my time in New York. And I tell people this admittedly, like I wasn't going to Fashion Week parties. I could have been, I wasn't. I was studying, and on the train, a lot of people would see me just highlighting like papers or writing or flashcards for design theory. Like I was moving through life as somebody, as an entrepreneur, which meant a ton of sacrifice. I worked every day from sun up to sundown. It was extremely hard, but I have a lot of experience with performance coaching. I was performance coached my whole life by a parent who was really intense. For those of you that are doctors' children, so you know how this goes. You know why we're not in medical school, because it's treacherous. But I just moved through life in a way that didn't always make me happy. I was extremely burned out. By the time I left New York, I was exhausted. It's a big reason why I live in LA now and why work-life balance and wellness is so, so important for me. It's why I stopped working at big tech companies, because I was totally burnt out. By the time I reached the pandemic, I was exhausted. It's probably lends itself to why I got so sick at the end of last year and into this year. But that being said, working that hard gave me a lot in return of just learning how to build relationships on the go and embedding myself into work. Even though it was admittedly a little bit too much, it gives me a lot more appreciation being on the other side of that now, where I don't do that. I refuse to work that much. I work part-time and I love it. And I'm able to move through life a lot differently. I slow down quite a bit now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ali. And thank you for joining us. It's been really fantastic to have you. Seriously, it's so great to see again the breadth of your work in such a short span of time. It's really, really impressive. So thank you so much for coming in and presenting to us. And thanks for everyone. Hope to see you guys again in 2 weeks. We'll have our second lecture in the series. And have a good one.
Thank you guys so much.